Well, welcome back to our study of the story of Jesus. And of course, we've not been, I don't know if you'd call this live or not, but certainly it's a new recording. But some of you have, over the last couple of weeks, watched the links that I've given you to sessions that I did on an overview of Mark and Luke because I had COVID and 2.5 weeks of it. And in the middle of all of that, I think many of you that have read the emails or read a little Facebook post know that we've also moved. So I'm actually in a little nook in our condo that is looks pretty similar to the setup that we had at our old house, but it's good to have you back with us. Also, we're going to do something a little bit different than we've been doing in the past. Instead of waiting until Thursday evening to be able to watch the video for the first time and then have access to the video afterwards, so few people are actually watching on Thursday nights. The overwhelming majority, 95% of you actually are watching the videos later. And so we're going to make the video that we shoot that normally comes on as a live stream. We're going to make that available as soon as possible. So we'll send out a link to you again, and then you can watch it whenever you want. Those of you that have been using this on Thursday nights, maybe for a small group or whatever, you can still watch it at that time, but it'll just be a little bit more accessible. This is our 13th session, although I guess if you were to count the two that I shared with you during the time that I had COVID, we've actually done 15 weeks now in the story of Jesus. But in terms of what we're trying to accomplish and just walking through the life of Christ, this is our 13th session. And this is a great one because what we're going to be doing in this session is we're going to be looking at a story that Jesus tells. And let me just begin by taking you over to Matthew chapter 13. This is sometimes referred to as the Parable of the Sower, but we'll get into that in a second. But we read this. That same day, Jesus went out of the house, sat by the lake. Such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat, sat in it, while all the people stood on the shore. Then he told them many things in parables. And so let me give you a little bit of a quick background here. Jesus was a storyteller, but he told a very special kind of story. He told stories that are called parables. Actually, our word parable is almost a transliteration of the Greek word, which is parabole. And it comes from two Greek words that basically mean to put two things alongside of each other. And what a parable was, it was a unique kind of a story. It was a fictitious story, but it had a spiritual message. Sometimes it really was almost a literal metaphor, because in Matthew chapter 13, which is where Matthew gathers a number of these stories together, oftentimes you'll read a little statement like, the kingdom of heaven is like, and when that word like shows up, of course, then we're really talking about a simile or a metaphor at that point in time. The story we're going to look at today, which might have been the very first parable that Jesus told, and probably one of the most important, I believe. And also, the context of it might have sounded somewhat familiar. Remember, we're up here in Capernaum, and this particular story, parable, is actually recorded in all three of the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But it's placed at different times in those three Gospels. And one of the things that I'm going to point out is that you probably recognize when we went through the story of Jesus calling Peter and the first disciples to himself. And you'll remember he was in Capernaum. The crowds had gathered around. He pushed out in his boat a little bit. And again, to remind you a little bit of what the background of that might have looked like, here's the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum right on the sea. And it was a little fishing village, so here's another little illustration. And remember, in Luke chapter 5, we're told that he got in Peter's boat, pushed back a little bit, and taught the crowds. But in Luke, we aren't told what he taught them. But in both Matthew and Mark, although they place this event a little different chronologically, what they tell us is that it is this story that Jesus was telling from the boat as the crowds were there on the shore. And oftentimes we refer to it again as the Parable of the Sower, which really means that it's a story about a farmer and his crops, but it has a spiritual message to it. And this particular parable, it's so important that virtually our entire spiritual life is determined by how well we understand and respond to this story. So again, crowds have been following him. He's pushed back a little bit. You can see almost a natural amphitheater there. Jesus gets Peter to let him get in the boat, and Peter pushes back a little bit, and Jesus begins to tell a story. And it goes something like this. A farmer went out to sow his seed. Now, basically, what that means is that he's planting his crop. And the way that was done at the time of Jesus is that, as you can see, even in some places today, is that the land was prepared and then the seed was sort of scattered by hand, and that was called sowing. And so in the story that Jesus tells, the farmer is sowing his seed, and as he scatters the seed, it's going to fall in a number of different places, all of which have some significance to the meaning of the parable that Jesus is going to explain a little bit later to his disciples. And so we're told this, that as he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate or snatched it up. So, you can almost imagine now, again, this was an agricultural society. Capernaum was a fishing village, so really the crowd would have been some kind of a mix probably of fishermen and farmers, but this really would have connected with his audience perhaps more so than most of us, maybe if we live in an urban setting. If you're a farmer, maybe this really would connect with you. So the farmer scatters his seed, and the first soil that it falls on is it kind of falls on the path. It's like some of this seed misses the soil that's prepared for the crop, and we're told that birds come along and snatch it up or eat it. You can almost imagine, again, because this would have been so relevant to the audience Jesus was speaking to, they would have seen this, this was something that was so familiar to them. It's almost that as he's speaking about that, they can imagine seeing the farmer sowing, and they can see seeds kind of flying through the air, and some, again, flying past the part that's been plowed. I believe it's Luke or it might be Mark that talks about how that actually the seed gets trampled on to begin with, but then birds come and swoop down and grab the seed and fly away. And of course, the outcome of that is that there's no crop that is produced. In other words, that seed becomes unfruitful, and that concept of something being fruitful, meaning productive or effective, again, is a metaphor that Jesus will use repeatedly in many of his stories. But But again, this seed gets snatched away, so nothing happens. It's not productive, it's not effective, and you might think of it that it's snatched. That word will actually appear in the explanation, and but just to sort of remember, I'm going to give you a couple of words. So one seed gets snatched and is unproductive. He goes on and says this: some of the seed fell on rocky places where it didn't have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow, but when the sun came up, the plants were scorched and they withered because they had no root. And so now we have a second kind of soil, you might say. This soil, it's rocky. This, again, would not have been, part of a field that had been well prepared to be planted. And the soil was shallow. And the seed actually springs up. It comes to some kind of fruition, but it's in shallow soil. And consequently, in the story, as the sun comes up, the plants get scorched and they wither because they had no roots. So you might, again, think of sort of a rocky kind of a soil, perhaps near, again, the field that had been prepared. And it's hard to imagine maybe just looking at the picture, but again, there's a little bit of growth, but then the sun comes along and scorches it. And the problem is that the roots are shallow. And so the heat of the sun is such that the roots aren't deep enough to be getting to whatever moisture is in the soil. And consequently, the result is that again, the crop is unproductive. It withers and it dies. And I can imagine, again, that this is an image that his audience would have been somewhat familiar with. They can visualize this. He's telling the story and they're sort of seeing it in their imagination that, the sun is beating down and there's a little bit of a crop showing, and the consequence is it gets scorches and it withers. So I guess the second word is scorched. So the first seed gets snatched, the second seed gets scorched. Jesus keeps going. He talks about a third kind of soil then. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. And so here's our third word, that some of the seed gets snatched, some of the plants get scorched. And here, again, the seed, it takes a little bit of root, but it's getting choked out because it's fallen among an area, again, that hasn't really been prepared to be planted, and it's there's just thorns, and as you can see, maybe something like this where some of the plant begins to come up, but everything around it is smothering it and it's choking out the plants. And so again, the seed takes root, the plants begin to grow, but the thorns choke it and kill it, and it yields no fruit. And again, I imagine that his audience would be kind of visualizing that because they probably had seen something like this happen before. And then he goes on to finish this simple little story. Again, we'll say that the third soil is choked, or if you want to alliterate and stick with that, it was snatched and it was scorched and it was smothered. You could use that word because that's the idea here. But he talks about a fourth kind of soil here. Still other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. And, again, I can imagine that for those that were there and hearing him, they could imagine this bountiful or multiple crop, which is, of course, what any farmer would hope would happen. And this particular soil was good soil, prepared, ready, wasn't hard, wasn't rocky, wasn't filled with weeds, and the result is that the seed, it takes root, it sprouts, it gets established, and it begins not only to produce a crop, but the crop multiplies. And so Jesus refers to it as a crop of 100, 60, 30. And so again, you can imagine this field that's filled with a crop in abundance, reproducing. Now, he's told this little story, and he's talked about, you know, these 4 different kinds of soil and what has happened. And you know, I can imagine that, you know, every eye is just zeroed in and focused on him, because now they want to know, well, what's the meaning, you know, of the story? You know, what's the punchline? What's the exclamation? And to the crowd, Jesus only really says one thing: whoever has ears, or he who has ears, let them hear. And he leaves. And so, you know, you've got a crowd here that maybe is trying to think about, well, what was the importance of all of that? In the text in Matthew chapter 13, there's a little bit of an explanation where Jesus talks about, well, why would he tell a story and not explain it to some? But now he's going to explain it to the disciples. And one of the things about this particular parable is that it's one of the few that Jesus actually explains. Oftentimes, and I think personally, some of the parables, when you read them, you know, they're difficult to understand, and you know, you get a sense perhaps that they're intended to be a story that you would meditate and reflect upon, trying to get a sense of what's the spiritual principle that's being communicated through this parable. Well, the good news again in this particular case is that Jesus is going to explain the parable. He's going to explain it to the disciples. And so in the text, if you drop down to verse 18, Jesus will begin to explain the meaning of this story. And so we read this. He says to his disciples now, "Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. This is the seed sown along the path." So the seed in the story Jesus is now explaining is, Luke says, the Word of God. Matthew refers to it as the message about the kingdom. And the soil that he speaks of in the story, the soil is people. And so, again, in the text, you know, he talks about, you know, the one who hears but doesn't understand. The soil is people. You and me, we are the soil, or I am the soil. And the story is really about a person's encounter with God, specifically in this parable, in terms of their encounter with God via God's Word. And there are this variety of experiences that take place in people's life. God, he's planting seeds in our life, is what Jesus is saying. They're seeds of spiritual potential, you might say, and he uses his Word. They become the seed that he is using to, you know, plant into the hearts of men and women, with the hope that that seed will bear fruit and become effective and productive. And so this is an immensely important parable that he tells. So we've got these 4 different kinds of people, and the first person is what I would maybe call the non-responsive hearer. They hear the word, but they don't respond. And their heart, in a sense, looking at the story, it's like a paved road or a hardened road. It wouldn't have been paved in Jesus' day, But the idea is that the seed really, there's no penetration of the truth. And then he talks about what is critically important, that this wild dynamic takes place that we're usually oblivious to. And that is, Luke says it's the devil. Matthew refers to him as the evil one. Mark calls him Satan. And what happens is that when there's not a response, where the heart or the soil is hard and there's not a response, Satan literally comes along and snatches away the word of God that has been spoken. And the idea there of snatching is really this idea of forcefully and quickly taking something away. And it's as if the slate gets wiped clean. And why does that happen? Well, sometimes it's simply because he, that is the evil one, he doesn't want people to believe or to become spiritually effective. Now, there's two primary contexts, I believe, in which this dynamic happens. One is for the person that is not yet a follower of Jesus, not yet a believer. And Luke actually uses the phrase that they don't believe, so they're hearing the message. They don't believe, and consequently they aren't saved. They don't experience God's salvation. Now, pre-Christian, for us that might mean, well, maybe we hear a message. Maybe it's at church. The pastor is speaking about what it means to have a relationship with Jesus. Or maybe it's in a conversation with a friend, and they're talking with you about, again, a relationship with Christ. Or maybe it's you're watching television, maybe a Billy Graham crusade or something, and you're being, what's being communicated is the good news about Jesus. And one of two things happens to us. This is, again, pre-Jesus in our lives. Either it makes no sense to us, we hear it, but it just, it doesn't connect. We don't really even understand what in the world someone is talking about. Or you hear it and you sense you should do something, but you decide you're going to wait. And so there's not a response. There's not an immediate response to the word that you've heard. And what happens is that when we don't respond, then the devil can come along and he snatches that away from us. We might not even remember it. And in a sense, we get hardened a little bit because we haven't responded. I think back in my own life, I really believe that there were a number of occasions when someone shared with me this great story, this good news about that I could have a relationship with Jesus, and that I could know God in a personal way. And I know that I heard that, but I also know I didn't respond to it. And consequently, it just kind of went away. And it wasn't until years later, when I was a university student, and I heard the message, and really sensed that I needed to respond to that and open my life to Christ and ask Christ to come in. And so in that instance, the seed wasn't snatched away. It at least got into my life and took root. So there's a pre-Christian dimension to this dynamic of hearing, not responding, and that word being snatched away. I think for most of us, it's a post-Christian experience where the same thing can happen. So again, you're in some kind of a context where you hear the truth, and whatever that truth is, it has something to do with your life, and God uses that truth to speak to you personally, and what he's looking for is some kind of a response. Let me just take a little bit of a tangent here, and this is perhaps kind of a personal conviction or opinion, but we know, based upon research that has been done about the modern church, what is it that people are looking for when they go to church. And amazingly, what the studies show is they're not really looking for some kind of a message from God to which they need to respond, and that dynamic take place for life-changing experience. What we're told, and I think that this has a lot to do with the fact that, particularly in America, we live in this culture of entertainment. And oftentimes, and I understand this, in order to perhaps attract people, oftentimes churches try to become a venue of entertainment. And what people are looking for is they're looking for some kind of a feeling, some kind of an experience, and conversations leaving the church oftentimes will be along the lines of, wow, that was really great this morning, or wasn't the worship great, or wasn't the message great, when the question I believe that we should be asking is, how did I do, Lord? Because when we come together, we're supposed to be coming to worship, and then also, what did you say to me today? What do I need to do to respond? Many of you might be familiar with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Bonhoeffer was a pastor, a theologian. He started his own seminary. He was a German. He lived during the time of Hitler, and actually became a part, almost toward the end of the war, a part of a group that had planned to assassinate Hitler, and he felt like he was supposed to be a part of that. And the plot was discovered literally days before the war ended almost. The plot was discovered, he was arrested, and he was put to death. But Bonhoeffer used to say, and it's interesting because I've read that he had kind of a funny voice. It wasn't anything that was overly attractive, but Bonhoeffer believed that his job was to communicate the scripture to the church, and literally to use as little personality or emotion or any kind of manipulation possible, in order that as he communicated the truth, that God could break through to the hearer and speak to them, and then they needed to respond. Now, I would suggest to you that it's rare anymore that you find that happening in a lot of churches. It's, again, there's a lot of pressure on to try to grow a church numerically, and in order to do that, sometimes we borrow from the culture. And I don't want to sound too critical, but again, you can go to a church service where they've got strobe lights and smoke machines going, and and rock and roll bands, and maybe the message is about how God really wants to bless your life, or wants to prosper you, and all of the things that a person sitting there wants to hear in order to draw more people in. Whereas what Jesus, I believe, is saying in the parable is that what is supposed to be happening is that when God sows a seed by you hearing a truth of Scripture, that then he's looking for you to respond to that. And that's really the context or the idea of what should be happening within the church. Well, what happens? Sometimes we hear, okay, we'll go back to our post-Christian experience. God might speak to us, again, in a worship service. It might be something in our life that He wants to see changed. It might be some action He wants us to take. It might be some truth He wants us to embrace. And we hear it, and we sense, perhaps, that, that God is speaking to us, but we wait to respond. And consequently, oftentimes when you wait, whatever sense of conviction you had when you heard that leaves, and you sort of forget. Well, what you don't know is the reason you're forgetting is because the devil has come along and he snatched that. He snatched that seed because we didn't respond, and consequently, we become hardened, and fruit, spiritual effectiveness, productivity doesn't take place, and we become ineffective. And it's just an amazing spiritual dynamic of a truth encounter. So how do you keep that from happening? Well, it's kind of simple. I'll give you a couple of quick little takeaways. I think the takeaway on this one is simple, that we have to learn somehow to practice immediate response. Now, let me give you an illustration, very, kind of worldly, perhaps. I don't know how to say it. But let's say that you get exposed to a ministry and they're in need, perhaps. And God sort of speaks to you as you hear about it, that you should do something. And maybe what you sense you're supposed to do is, let's say you're supposed to give some money to that particular ministry, and you have that sense sitting there when you hear about it, but you don't respond immediately. And you maybe you leave, let's say it's a church service, and over time you sort of forget what you were supposed to do or thought you were supposed to do, and consequently it gets snatched away from you and you miss a blessing. So there needs to be sort of an immediate response, and it's something we tend to have to practice. So in that particular setting, perhaps you pull your checkbook out right there in church and you write a check, or you get home and you write a check, and you're going to respond to what you think it is that God has told you to do. So when you sense God is speaking, you practice immediate response, and what happens is it keeps Satan from snatching the seed away. Jesus continues to explain the parable. So he's going to go on here, and he's going to talk about that second soil. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone. So again, the ground is a person. The seed is the Word of God. Refers to someone who hears the Word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. And when trouble or persecution comes because of the Word, they quickly fall away. So here's our second, ground again. Now, again, remember that in the story, the seed actually just barely took root, and the plant began to grow. And then the sun came along, scorched it, and it withered. Jesus parallels that by saying that, that the person does respond, but there aren't spiritual roots there. And consequently, when difficulties or tribulation or persecution comes along, this person stumbles or falls. And again, that would be what that image of the plant being withered. Now, notice it's the same seed. It's God's truth. It's His Word. It's received with joy, which is great, but the soil's inadequate. It's like an immature faith, and the roots are very shallow. And when the time of testing comes, which is when the heat comes on, the result is that the person really doesn't have enough maturity to get through the tough times, and oftentimes they will fall away. There's a lack of depth here. So how do you keep from getting scorched? And the obvious answer, I think, to that would be that we have to deepen our spiritual roots, and because tough times are going to come, the heat is going to come. What roots need to be deepened? What are roots? What might that mean? I'll give you just 5 quick ones, which would be a whole message in and of itself, by the way. So again, deepen our roots. Well, one would be the root of knowledge, which simply means that we spend time learning the scriptures, really studying them. So even being in a context like we're in this little session, hopefully you got some growing knowledge, but also studying the Word on your own. Prayer obviously is another means to deepening our roots, and I'd say a lot of people have very shallow prayer roots. So that's an area that most of us need a little bit of help in. There's the root of fellowship, that instead of trying to do this on our own, that we really need each other, and times of meaningful fellowship where we really are sharing our lives together, praying for each other, getting honest with each other, and that as we spend time in that kind of a situation, the root of fellowship grows deeper. Service, I think this is a big watershed in many believers' lives. They you might go to church for years and years, and you might really know the scriptures well, and have a prayer life and are involved in fellowship, but you haven't engaged in some way where you can actually serve the kingdom of Christ. And so serving becomes very important. It's another one of those significant roots that keeps us grounded when we actually get plugged into some kind of service or ministry. And then finally, generosity. And I think this is a biggie too, because we're going to see, one of the things that Jesus talks about. I've heard that the number one subject that Christ addresses in the Gospels is the kingdom of God, which is a really all-encompassing of what it means to be in relationship with Christ. And that the second subject that he talks about more than any other is the subject of money, because in our world, we have been brainwashed into thinking that that true success is measured by the amount of our bank statement, and we even use the expression, well, what are they worth? And what we're asking there is, well, how much money does that person have? So generosity, there's nothing evil about wealth, resources, money in and of themselves, but there is the love of money, which I think it's John says is the root of all evil. So generosity is important, that we are givers, and that we take what God has blessed us with and we become faithful in our stewardship. So we need to deepen our spiritual roots. Then he goes on and he explains the third kind of soil. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life, the deceitfulness of wealth, and I'm throwing in what Luke says here, and the pleasures of this world choke the word, making it unfruitful. So this is the person that hears, they believe, growth begins, but I would say that then they get distracted. And the distractions are all around us, as matter of fact, and it's like weeds that are choking out the effectiveness of our spiritual lives. 3 big distractions or thorns that Jesus talks about in the text. One, he talks about the anxieties of the age, or the worry about life. And we live in a time I believe, at least in my lifetime, I can't think of another period of time where there was more anxiety about what was happening in the world than the days in which we live. I mean, we're surrounded by crisis, and of course we look at things like the war in the Ukraine and what Russia is doing there. We look at the fact that we're still in a pandemic, although I think many people think that it's over, and I can tell you from firsthand experience it isn't over. 1 million people in the United States have died from COVID. I mean, that's mind-boggling. And so, anxiety can sort of choke out our spiritual effectiveness. Secondly, he talks about the deceitfulness of riches. And again, most of us have grown up in this culture where we're told that money's going to make you happy, that money is going to give you personal value, that the winner is the one that has the most. And I think what Jesus is saying here is that's deceit. That there's only a certain amount of resources that you need in order to be happy, and those resources aren't what really give you value anyway. And if your identity is rooted in how much money you have, usually sooner or later you're going to have a pretty big shakeup there because you've been deceived. So again, that deceitfulness of wanting to acquire more and more, it can choke out our spiritual lives. And then Luke uses the expression, the pleasures of the world. And again, I think we live in a culture of entertainment. We're constantly looking for different ways to be entertained, and there's nothing wrong with entertainment. There's nothing wrong, with pleasure. But when it consumes us, then the result of that is that our spiritual lives are going to suffer from it. And we're going to become ineffective because these are the things that will choke out spiritual effectiveness and productivity. And so the takeaway on it, I think, is, again, pretty simple, is that somehow we need to learn to minimize unhelpful distractions. We need to, figure out what in my life in these areas is out of balance, perhaps. What kinds of corrections might I need to make? And again, if you pray about that, normally you'll get some kind of a sense of, and sometimes we know what the things are that are choking out our spiritual lives. I think sometimes we're oblivious to it. So again, we want the Lord to show us what are some things that I need to minimize in order that I might be more effective. Now, the story has good news also, because there's a fourth soil, and Jesus is going to talk about that. And here's what he says. But the one who received the seed that fell on good soil is the man who hears the word, understands it, I've added, responds to it, and he produces a crop, yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. Luke says that this is the person that has a good and noble heart. In other words, the heart's not hard, the heart's not shallow, the heart's not cluttered. The heart is good and it's noble. The soil is good. The soil has been prepared for the seed. And the result is that this is the person that hears and responds, and in responding becomes effective and productive in their spiritual life and produce a, quote, crop, again, 160 or 30-fold. Well, let's wrap this up for this morning. What is the spiritual life like? What's the kingdom like? And according to this story, this parable, Well, it's like a farmer that has 4 different kinds of soil that the seed that he is spreading lands on, so that some people have hearts like paved highways and the seed gets snatched, and you know, how do you avoid that? Well, you learn to practice immediate response here. Let's get up. Some people have hearts that are like rocky soil, okay? And how do you avoid that? Well, you got to learn to deepen your spiritual roots. Some people have hearts like soil that's filled with weeds, and again, your spiritual life is getting smothered or choked out, and you avoid that by learning to minimize unhelpful distractions. And the result is that if you are able to do those things, then you become good kingdom soil, and you become a person whose heart can bear kingdom fruit and whose spiritual life can be effective and productive. And I think I would just, wrap things up this morning by asking 2 critical questions. And I'm going to ask you to ask yourself this and to reflect upon it. The first question is awfully simple, and that simply is, well, what kind of soil are you? As you hear the story, do you connect with one of these 4 different kinds of soil? And then the second really important question is, what kind of soil do you want to be? Do you want to be a man or woman who yields and produces and is effective, and whose spiritual life is all that Christ wants it to be, and that you have cultivated a good heart where God's seed can take root and can bear fruit? So that's the first of the parables that Jesus tells. You might go to Matthew chapter 13 and read through it, because again, Matthew has compiled a number of parables and put them in one place instead of them being spread out like they are in the other Gospels. And I'm not going to be able to go into all of those parables, so it would be good for you to go back and read. And that brings us really then to our next session, and what we're going to do, I believe, in our next session, all things considered, I want to show how the rest of the 12 get called. So we'll end up, instead of with 6 followers or apostles, we're going to end up with the 12. And then I might give you a quick little kind of an overview or introduction to the Sermon on the Mount. We aren't going to have time to go into depth in that. That's a whole nother study in and of itself, but I do want to expose you and show you what's there and hit on some of the highlights of that. So anyway, hopefully you're watching this on video, and again, I'll be sending out a link. You probably, by the time you're watching this, maybe you've already had the link, and you now can watch the videos anytime that's convenient for you. And I know summer's coming up, and we'll kind of take a look at how we want to approach that in terms of carrying on with our study. So we'll see you next week. Thanks for joining us in this study of the story of Jesus.